Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Chris, and I was already introduced, otherwise, I would have talked a bit about that myself. I am a clinical anesthesiologist, so I work part of my time in a hospital environment. And as Daniel already pointed out, the topics that I look into are sometimes considered a bit dry, even for a data scientist, because it's semantics and it's all about structure. So I'm trying to motivate this a bit more with a clinical view on all of this. So it's about a concept that is probably not that well known. So the virtual human twin is generally what formerly was called the digital twin. So I also hope to give you some insights what that means and how that might arrive in hospitals. Um, forward. There you go. So first of all, I need to make some disclosures. I am with ISO, so in a standards organization. I am in a working group with Martin Golubiewski here from HITS in Heidelberg, another HITS, differently spelled. And we look into data processing and integration, so metadata for the biomedical realm. I have a research cooperation with a startup that looks into numerical modeling of lungs and ventilation. Um, we are funded by the Federal Ministry for Economics, Climate Protection. The project's called Empower. I had a close collaboration with Philips. I didn't receive any royalties, no stock, nothing. I never was paid for this, apart from my normal role in my hospital. However, this shaped my view on data integration a bit. So this is a something I have to disclose. And I also have a very, very minor stock in an EHR manufacturer, but that is not of relevance today. So before I get into the pictogram that I used to structure the talk, I wanted to give a little prequel. So I gathered that I need to explain some things. And first of all, I wanted to motivate why I was talking about this today with a bit of real world insights and that the people in this school might not have at a regular basis. So if I'm not in the institute, I am actually in theater or intensive care. I see patients. I have an environment that is, for most people, quite hard to grasp because it's nothing that you normally are exposed to. And if you are exposed to it, we give you medications so you forget that you were exposed to it. However, we deal with acute medicine. So we have a multimodal and messy process, and messy not in the sense that it is unordered, but messy in the sense that many things happen, many processes influence the data that we are collecting. We are collecting a host of data. So this is something that made it interesting to go down that route that Daniel pointed out before, to actually try to collect that data because it's of high value if you think about the four V's in the sense of variety of data. The clinical phenomena that we look at are highly dynamic and synchronous. That means that a patient can have many problems at the same time. So basically might have a problem with their lungs, with their heart. There's a surgeon involved most of the time if we are in theater. So they might actually do something to the patient that they don't like that much, physiologically speaking. So these are all things that we have to try to unwrap and get a mental model of what is happening to the patient and ideally bring in a bit of order and control. So to actually find solutions to these acute problems. So we make the patient better and we influence the patient trajectory within minutes or seconds sometimes, so they won't take harm from from their encounter with hospital. There is a quote from one of the first chairs in academic anesthesiology, and it goes that each anesthetic is like a clinical experiment. In that sense, we do not 100% know, for example, how we switch off the state of mind that we call consciousness. However, it works. And this is something that's quite difficult to accept, especially if you are coming from physiology, from a mechanistic understanding of medicine. So we would like to better understand what we do. And the same holds true for our cardiac interventions that we do, for our pulmonary interventions, all these organs that we treat ad hoc, and we want to safeguard from taking harm. And another interesting aspect of my clinical work is that we are incredibly bad with our evidence level. So normally you would expect in cardiology to find a large randomized controlled trials. That means that thousands of patients get a specific drug in a specific dosage, and you observe patients over a long period to make sure that they actually don't suffer harm from the medication. They have an actual treatment benefit. All of these things, due to the highly dynamic situation that we find ourselves in, we do know what our medication does, but we cannot 100% be sure that it is of good evidence what we do. However, due to some reason over the years, with a different approach to scientific practice, which is basically clinical physiology, we have made care in anesthetic theaters much more safe, and also in ICU. We see much improved outcomes for the patient, even though that we don't have good evidence. So I'm posed with the problem that I need to individualize care for patients on the spot, and I need to have good models for that. And this is the motivation where I come from, and this is probably also explaining why I arrived at the stuff that I'm doing now. I put in the title, the FAIR principles. This is something that's fairly important to me, because the only way that we can reach a point where we can work on the data that we are collecting, despite it being messy, it is very valuable. We need to somehow structure it in a way that people that actually know how to work with the data, which is you, basically, can access it. So the FAIR principles were published in 2016 in Scientific Data. It arose from the problem of the so-called reproducibility crisis in biomedicine, which meant that published results couldn't be reproduced by independent groups despite the peer review process. And this was something that took a big hit on the general scientific community. So it was found that it would be ideal to find measures to overcome these problems with not irreproducible research. So FAIR is an acronym, as you could read. It means findable. That means that the data and the metadata is actually findable, that you can browse, humans and computers can have means of access to look through the data and to understand what is in the data set. And then also also access in the sense of extract the conditions under which the data was collected, to actually pull the data under certain provenance aspects, obviously, but also to make machines able to read and access the data. How is this done? It is done by making data interoperable. That means that the data and the metadata should be standardized according to their concepts, and this is done by vocabularies, ontologies, theory. That's what I do at the Institute for Medical Informatics, mainly looking after that. But also syntactically, so it integrates well with other applications that might be in need to use that data later on, not initially specified in the sense when the data was collected. And ideally, this is the last thing, the data can be reusable. That means that the metadata and data has a well-described usage specification, which means licenses. You're pretty well accustomed to that. If you look, for example, on GitHub, you will find licenses to the software that you're using. And this is not necessarily done on a regular basis in the medical realm if you think about data. So this is something to take care of if you want to work with data. So stepping back from medicine and trying to explain why it is important to verify data, not only to make science more reproducible, but also to understand the promise that it holds. I wanted to make that example when I was asked to give this lecture, but there was a good twist to this just recently, and I'll come to that in the next slide. So I've been interested in the whole structural biology aspect in biomedicine for years and years. I've attended the inaugural symposium of the Center for Structural and Systems Biology in Hamburg, where they built this cool X-ray laser to understand the molecular geometry of complex proteins and biomolecular entities. There's a host of different science working groups looking into these problems of protein folding. Some of you might know this if you have some affiliation with bioinformatics, and it is a fairly complex scientific problem. So there, I've seen and I've met a great many different postdocs and doctoral students trying to decipher protein structures. There's loads and loads of papers like the energy landscape, where I pulled this paper from, where they tried to predict amyloid fibril formation from the steric organization, so the physical principles of how these molecules form. And the community over these years and years, so decades of the scientific endeavor, have tried to verify their data and their software. So you have things that are community curated, like UniProt, gene ontology, but also software stacks like Bioconductor and other R packages, where people work together to actually make this community research more feasible, because each and every person alone wouldn't be able to approach this problem in the first place. And then, like I said, I was very happy that the example that I wanted to make anyway actually won the Nobel Prize this year. So as you probably all know, Google DeepMind, on the back of all that community work, has devised a neural net that can predict the physics-based structural interactions of proteins from sequences. So from amino acid sequences, you can actually find the structure of large multi-domain proteins. Now you can do drug screening, you can develop vaccines. All these things are now possible due to the work not only of the people that are obviously brilliant at DeepMind and Professor Becker. However, it was the work of the community that verified their data to actually arrive at a point where they could just use these large databases in that are held in a well-curated form and in a fair form. So why should we do this in hospital? My take on this is coming from my time in computational physiology. So this was the work that I've done in the UK when I was there. It's called the Interdisciplinary Collaboration in Systems Medicine. It's a fairly, let's say, non-deep learning model. So it's a classical simulation study. It's fairly complex still. It's probably around 150 compartment model, loads and loads of ordinary differential equations representing different parts of the body, and it depicts the cardiopulmonary system. We have a loss function in there. You could call it loss function. We call it differently. However, it's an engineering complex optimization problem. And what we needed always was valid data because it's highly parameterized. So it represents different aspects of the body, consisting of different structures in the heart, like the atria and the ventricles, but also different circulatory entities like the pulmonary, the splanchnic, cerebral arteries and veins. All these things are represented, and all these things have different resistances, capacitances, inductances, etc., etc. All these biomechanic properties that you'd normally have a hard time measuring in a patient, but sometimes we do measure them routinely, and some of these parameters can also be inferred from other parameters that we measure. So I saw some benefit in actually making that resource that we measure in cath labs, like catheter labs in cardiology or in theaters on a day-to-day basis available for research, because I wanted to basically build my models better and have less work with looking through old studies that recorded these parameters. So this is the motivation, and now I'll come to the concept I called connect, store, integrate, and I tried it. I hope this makes sense to some degree, and I'll drag along that pictogram. So first of all, the connection part, which is very much clinically centered. So this is nitty gritty, but it is key if you want to look into findable and accessible aspects of care. So if you think about hospital IT, and most of you being from data science won't be involved with this, and I compliment you on that wise decision not to get involved with this. Most hospital ITs are fairly complex. So this is a pictogram from Western Academic Medical Center, namely Geneva. They presented this at one of the IEEE outlets. And you would say you'd probably find 100 subsystems in such an information landscape, and this is just software. All these different information systems have specific data models that are mostly proprietary. They're mostly not provided by people that would be easily asked to give you new developments in community or internationally validated standards. And also you have various devices and data models on these devices that you can connect to these information systems, and that you have to think about how to somehow hold in place. And obviously, with the devices, there has been a host of different approaches throughout time. And in my field, you'll find especially small groups that are very motivated and have a decent understanding of med tech, but also of software. And I brought you one example, which is called VitalDB. It's a collaboration between a group from Denmark and a group from South Korea. They devised free software in an open repository. It's actively developed, which is always a good sign, because most medical software in that realm that is open and free to use is sometimes published and then nobody looks after it after a certain working group desists of maintaining it. They have devised a considerable driver range for different medical devices that collect data on at the bedside. So this is quite impressive. However, they have taken the approach that you'll find mostly in biomedicine or in clinical care, basically. They have put up a recorder program, so you can put it on a laptop, or now they have devised something that you can run on a Raspberry Pi. But still, you need to run around the operating room, the catheter lab, or any other clinical environment and connect your multiple patient monitoring devices via serial cables to that device to read the data and then basically carry it over to your data collection initiative. And that is not a very scalable solution, as you hopefully agree. We had a bit of a different approach, and I was very lucky to be able to participate in this. This was a clean slate in Heidelberg, where they built a new surgical building. There was loads of other people that already thought about the physical aspects of building that and making it possible to then look into that a priori integrated medical technology and IT infrastructure within that new surgical building. And there was also a reasonable effort put into acquiring off-the-shelf solutions or having strong partners to integrate data from that hospital building into a more general data collection initiative, and that was the data lake of the Medical Informatics Initiative at our site. This is a large research consortium that has been running for years in Germany, and associated with that large routine data collection, and large means that, for example, only for the signals we get 10 terabytes a year uncompressed from that 260 monitoring units that are in that hospital. But we also did a medical study that then collected patient-reported outcomes and meaningful clinical outcomes, as well as a biobanking initiative that was done by the clinical partners in this and the more biomedically centered partners. And so this means there was a big medical interest behind that infrastructure development. And this is something that I can recommend, that if you ever want to do this with a backing from clinical medicine. Otherwise, it can be very tough to impossible. So if you have your data and you want to store it, you have to think about how to store it. And you can reach out early and you can try to standardize your data at the source level, so within medical IT at some point. So, for example, for the biomedical signal data, or in general, I would recommend looking into the ISO 11073. So a couple of vendors now also bought into this and really mean business. So this can be quite interesting for all people that might be weary about it. HL7 Fire is integrated in that standard family. Obviously, there is the example of DICOM, which is the standard for images. However, there is still a lot of medical information systems and devices that send PDF or images like JPEG or PNGs or whatever. So DICOM is still obviously very popular in radiology and has a good penetration into the vendor-based data structuring. However, other image modalities don't have that standardization. And then obviously you'll find a lot of talk about Odyssey, namely OMOP, Common Data Model, or HL7 Fire. Obviously, Open EHR is a big contender. Then there is connections between all these standards that are that are also developed in conjunction with the vendors of medical software and devices. And then there is the CDISC family for more regulatory compliance data processing and data structuring. All of these have associated vocabularies. I won't get into detail. You can ask me. I can talk about that for ages. We have seen a fairly high community motivation behind getting on the bandwagon for any of these standards. And I am quite hopeful that this is something that will develop. And I just have a small caveat, and that I also ask whether the vendors really have a genuine interest of having such a platform ecosystem that you would want to shape with having all your medical data in that standardized format, or whether there is some business interest in vendor lock-in. But from what I can tell, many progressive private companies have looked into complying with these standards. So this is a positive note. If you look at initiatives that find data within their institution, collect it, store it, they have traditionally taken approaches of having basically large SQL dumps that they provide and having a more or less structured logic of how they provide their data. So where I've taken this from is the people from MIT, LCP. So you probably, if you have done some data science in medicine, you probably heard of Mimic. They've done this for 30 years, so there wasn't many standards around they could use for their real world clinical data. And the problem with that is that you always end up with attempts for local structuring and repetitive pre-processing, which doesn't scale. It is really nothing that we should be doing each and every time that we try to do some machine learning study in biomedicine or in medicine, to actually get into the database structure and try to find out what the clinicians meant when they documented this and that in their primary system. And this is repeated in other databases, like, for example, in Amsterdam. However, there is initiatives from these groups to also go towards a more fair structuring of their data. Particular problems are the binary large objects. So basically, binary files from high resolution data, which are impossible to navigate if you just put them in an SQL database. And there is also not that broad of a software stack to operate on the file systems that are inherent to PhysioNet standards. So I found another approach quite interesting that has been talked about by many people. For example, people from Cambridge around Aria Cole, the group around LAD in the US, and it's a file system called HDF5. It comes with the metadata. It has fairly extensive software stack around it because it was developed by NASA due to their similar problems with geospatial data. So you have the same problems that you have high resolution data domains, but also low resolution. Let's say once a week, once a year, things are measured and you have to store them together. So there have been, on the back of this data format, which is optimized for I/O, some propositions like the critical care data exchange format or the biosignal ML from a group in Auckland, Peter Hunter's group. And this might be valuable, especially for the signal domain, but also you could probably put in DICOM files into that same structure and work on that. So if you managed to actually store your data in a fairly interoperable way, it's findable, it's accessible, you can reuse it. So this was shown last year by a group from NHS Digital, published in Lancet Digital Health. And I've just pulled the point cloud from that publication. And each point cloud is a stakeholder in the NHS ecosystem that has made a pull from their core data set and has worked with that data specifically that they provide for all people that are allowed to work with that data within the UK system. So it is possible. You can actually, due to coordinated action and community spirit and sufficient resources in the right places, reach a point where you can put studies like this out, where you can just report on how much data is used, not speaking of all the studies and the value that is pulled from this initiative down the road. So eventually, and this is what you probably were most interested in, I'd guess, coming to this lecture, would be integrate. So it means that the actual reuse, according to interoperable standards, with modern software stacks. So I brought some examples of approaches that people have taken. So first of all, and these were fairly early with it, it was the Stanford group. They had industry, like heavy industry collaboration in setting up their data pipelines. I call it STAR. They have included high resolution data in their data capture, which is also something they've done with Philips. They also relied on PhysioNet and EDF formats, so file system uncompressed. A bit hard to navigate, so there is room for improvement, definitely. But what they've done is they collaborated with Google Cloud Platform, and they have then broken access to the BigQuery and all the other software stacks that are hosted by these vendors. And if you have a lot of money and you are quite good with data protection, it might even be possible in Germany to do that now, because due to the recent changes in legislation, this should be possible if you want to do that. Yeah. I also wanted to have a look at the things that have been managed, like the outcomes that have been reached with the medical informatics initiative that has been running for years. So they are now providing a central service for public researchers in Germany to access this routine data that is collected across all university hospital sites, and you can then perform studies on the core data set as far as it is developed. So there's fairly a considerable amount of data in there, and you can envision that this will only continue to grow. So this is something to keep in mind as well. Something that I found very impressive is what the radiologists did. Mind that they have an established standard that their operational systems in hospital work with since the 90s, and this is DICOM. So there is a considerably less heavy amount of standardization that they would need to do to get all their data in harmonized forms. However, it was quite impressive, and this was also done at DKFZ in part, that they've reached a joint imaging platform and they now collaborate. And this is something to keep in mind. It's always about clinical collaboration. Do clinicians want to share their data? This is a very important question that should be asked apart from the data harmonization. But they can do cross-site data exchange. They can actually do machine learning on a container-based environment. And this is quite impressive because this is quite modern and quite state-of-the-art. And I found that very impressive. So this was the part about structuring and all that, all these things to make it fair. And I already said that I have a motivation to reach a certain modeling culture that is called virtual human twin by a sum. So this is, for example, the origin of that term. It's a think tank that is hosted by the European Union, or the European Commission to be correct. It's a load of engineers, some medtech manufacturers, and they envisioned a federated platform as an infrastructure for all stakeholders to partake. They have proposed other standards, so it's in total 158 standards that could be used. And they've published that as an open collection on fair sharing. And they put forward a prototype. So this might be something that we all towards, that we find more liberal platform ecosystems where researchers and data scientists can plug in and actually use the data under regulated regulated access terms and conditions, and this is something that we have to look into. But also, what I always ask in these initiatives is, what's the incentive for the people that have to do all the clinical work and all the IT work to make these data sources available for research? So sharing is nice, and I'm all for fair sharing and open sharing of data, but some people need to be incentivized, especially if you think about the resource that goes into the semantic concept mapping of clinical data that is non-trivial and cannot be performed by many people apart from medically trained professionals. So I want to close with an outlook in the sense of why, like how can this look? How can this look like? So this is something that was published by the group around Michaela van der Schaar from Cambridge, and by the group around Paul Elbers from Amsterdam. So clinicians and data scientists working together, and they have, on the basis of a COVID data set, produced a NeuroIPS paper that devised a machine learning architecture that informs an ODE, ordinary differential equation model of pharmacology, something that we use for ages in medicine, but which are quite tedious to devise. So they took their intensive care data, did extensive pre-processing, and managed to have then a simulation model that clinicians could interact with, could try to make in silico studies with. So in silico means that you test something out in the computer rather than on the patient, and this can be something that will be much more important in the future for example, drug development, because you do not longer have to test things out in animals, for example. So they've reached that point where they could, in this case, predict the blood concentration of corticosteroids, something that you give in COVID, but you never really know, is that beneficial for the patient? So I found that very respectable and a very interesting finding. And at last, and this is a bit of advertisement for ourselves, if I may, we are also trying to do these things. So we are trying to plug in advanced numerical modeling with the help of machine learning within a secure research environment in the hospital to inform ventilation in ICU. This is something that we do with a group from Munich. It's a company called Edenbelt, and they have expertise in doing fluid structure interaction modeling of lungs and simulating morphological ventilation, gas exchange, all these things in fully explainable models. And we have reached a point where we can actually connect our data source up to that. And we're also doing a project with the group around Axel Löwe. So Julian Mirsch, he's a HITS PhD student. He's trying to connect the advanced cardiac modeling that Axel will talk about in his HIDA lecture to our clinical data set and predict the onset of perioperative atrial fibrillation. So when the atria of the heart go into chaotic action. And with this, I wanted to end, and I wanted to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.